"You might want to turn that camera off," the woman said quietly, her voice steady enough to cut through the static crackle of the police radio. But Officer Daniel Hayes only smirked as the red and blue lights painted the quiet suburban street in restless flashes, the glow bouncing off parked SUVs and manicured lawns like something out of a scene that had played out 100 times before. Except this time there was something different in the air, something he couldn't quite name, something that made the silence between each radio dispatch feel heavier than it should have been. But he ignored it the way he ignored most things that didn't fit into the version of control he believed he owned, his hand resting casually on the edge of the patrol car as the body cam on his chest blinked its steady recording light, capturing every second as he looked down at the woman standing in front of him, her coat simple, her posture calm, her eyes not defiant but not submissive either, just present, as if she were observing him rather than the other way around. And that alone irritated him more than anything she could have said, because in his world people either pushed back or backed down, and she was doing neither. She was just standing there, holding a slim leather folder against her side like it mattered more than the situation unfolding around her, like the flashing lights and the growing circle of curious onlookers with their phones raised didn't exist, like this moment was. Just another step in something much bigger that only she understood. "Step to the side, ma'am," Hayes said, his tone clipped, practiced, the kind that carried authority without needing volume. But she didn't move right away, and that hesitation, that fraction of a second where she simply looked at him, made something tighten in his chest, not fear, not yet, just a flicker of discomfort he quickly buried under routine. Because routine was safe, routine was predictable, routine didn't ask questions. He reached for his radio, murmuring something about a possible situation, his words blending into the low hum of the evening as a neighbor's porch light flicked on and a car slowed at the end of the block, the world inching closer to witness. And still she stood there, her breath visible in the cool night air, her fingers tightening slightly around the folder as if grounding herself in something real, something that couldn't be taken or twisted. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Hayes added, a faint edge creeping into his voice now, because control was slipping, just a little, just enough for him to feel it. And that feeling always demanded correction, always demanded action. But before he could move, before he could turn this into something louder, something final, she spoke again, softer this time, almost like she was reminding him of something he hadn't realized he'd forgotten. "Just make sure it's all on record," she said, her eyes briefly flicking to the camera on his chest, then back to his face. And for the first time since the stop began, Hayes hesitated, just for a second, just long enough for the silence to stretch, for the distant murmur of voices and the faint click of phone cameras to settle into the moment like dust. And in that pause, something shifted, something subtle but undeniable, like the scene had already been set long before he arrived, like he had stepped into a story that wasn't his to control, and the realization lingered there, quiet, unwelcome, as the recording light continued to blink, steady, unblinking, capturing everything. Angela Brooks did not look away when the hesitation flickered across his face. She simply adjusted her grip on the leather folder, the faint creak of the material barely audible beneath the low hum of the cruiser engine idling beside them. And in that small, almost invisible movement, there was a kind of quiet certainty that did not belong in moments like this. Not in situations where most people rushed to explain themselves or tried to shrink under the weight of authority. But she did neither. She stood with the stillness of someone who had already measured the outcome and found no reason to rush it. And that stillness began to stretch into the space between them, filling it with something heavier than tension, something closer to expectation, as Hayes cleared his throat and shifted his stance, forcing his attention back into the familiar rhythm of procedure. Because procedure meant control, and control meant clarity, and clarity meant he did not have to question why her calm felt so out of place. "I asked you to step to the side," he repeated, slower this time, each word deliberate, as if saying it differently would change the shape of the moment. But Angela only inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the instruction without immediately obeying it, her eyes moving briefly past him toward the growing line of parked cars and quiet observers, neighbors drawn by the flashing lights and the unspoken promise of something worth watching, their phones held chest high, screens glowing faintly in the dark like a second set of eyes that never blinked. And for a brief second her gaze lingered there, not with concern, not with embarrassment, but with a kind of awareness that seemed to include them in the moment rather than exclude them. As if every witness mattered, as if every angle of what was happening needed to exist. "You are creating a scene," Hayes added, the edge in his voice sharpening as he gestured subtly toward the onlookers. But she did not follow his gesture. She remained focused on him, her expression steady, her voice when it came even quieter than before. "No, officer, the scene is already here," she said, and something about the way she said it, not defensive, not challenging, just factual, made the words land differently than he expected, like they were not meant to push back, but to point something out, something obvious that he had somehow missed. And that realization unsettled him more than resistance would have, because resistance he knew how to handle. Resistance gave him a script, but this calm, this quiet refusal to play along, left him without one. And for a moment the sounds around them seemed to sharpen, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the low murmur of voices blending into a soft, continuous backdrop, grounding the moment in a reality that felt increasingly difficult to control. Hayes exhaled slowly, his hand brushing against the body cam as if to reassure himself that it was still there, still recording, still capturing the version of events he intended to present. And that thought steadied him, because documentation meant authority, meant his perspective would be the one that mattered, the one that lasted. And with that confidence returning, he straightened, his tone firming again as he reached toward the folder in her hand. "I am going to need to see what you are holding," he said, extending his hand with the expectation that it would be given without question. But Angela did not immediately release it, her fingers tightening just slightly, not in defiance, not in resistance, but in intention, as if that folder carried weight beyond its thin edges, beyond the simple appearance of paperwork. And for a fraction of a second their hands hovered in the same space, not touching, not yet, suspended in a moment that felt far longer than it actually was, before she finally spoke, her voice calm, measured, and impossibly certain. "You will see it," she said, "just not the way you expect." And the words settled into the air between them with a quiet finality that Hayes could not quite explain, only feel, a subtle shift that suggested the direction of this encounter had already changed, even if he had not realized it yet. The words lingered longer than they should have, settling into the space between them like a quiet warning that refused to be ignored. And Officer Hayes felt it again, that subtle disruption in the rhythm he relied on, the one that usually guided every interaction from start to finish without deviation. But this time the sequence fell off, like a step taken half a second too early. His hand still extended toward the folder, as if the motion itself could restore order, as if the simple act of taking it would anchor the moment back into something predictable. Yet Angela did not move to meet his hand, and the stillness that followed was not empty. It was filled with something deliberate, something measured, as if she were allowing the silence to do part of the work for her. And around them the quiet street seemed to lean in closer, the low hum of a passing car fading into the distance, while the glow of phone screens multiplied, each one capturing the scene from a slightly different angle, each one preserving a version of what was happening that Hayes could not control. And that realization brushed against the edge of his thoughts, unwelcome but persistent, as a second patrol car turned the corner slowly, its headlights sweeping across the houses before settling behind his cruiser, the engine idling low as another officer stepped out, his expression uncertain as he took in the scene, his eyes moving from Hayes to Angela and back again as if trying to read something that had not yet been spoken aloud. "Everything good here?" the officer asked, his tone casual, but his posture cautious. And Hayes nodded quickly, too quickly, his focus still fixed on the woman in front of him, as if acknowledging anything else would mean losing hold of the moment entirely. "Just a routine check," he replied, the words sounding thinner than he intended, like they lacked the weight they usually carried. And Angela heard it too, not the words themselves but the slight shift beneath them, the way confidence had begun to fray at the edges. And she let that realization sit without reacting to it, her gaze steady, her breathing even, her presence unchanged, as if she were standing outside the tension rather than inside it. And the second officer shifted his weight, glancing again at the phones pointed in their direction, at the quiet attention gathering in the shadows of front yards and sidewalks. And for a moment, he hesitated before stepping a little closer, lowering his voice just enough that it did not carry. "You might want to wrap this up," he murmured, not as an order but as a suggestion, one officer to another, and Hayes felt the pressure of it. The expectation that this would resolve cleanly, quickly, without complication, because that was how things were supposed to go. That was how they always went. And yet nothing about this felt simple anymore. Nothing about it felt contained. His eyes flicking once more to the body cam on his chest, the small red light blinking steadily, indifferent to the tension, indifferent to the uncertainty, recording everything without judgment. And that thought should have reassured him. It should have grounded him in the certainty that his version of events would hold. But instead it sharpened the awareness that every detail mattered now. Every word, every pause, every choice. And that awareness made the moment heavier, slower, as if time itself had begun to stretch, and Angela finally shifted, not away from him, but slightly to the side, just enough for the light to catch the edge of the folder in her hand. The faint outline of a badge clipped inside, barely visible for a fraction of a second before the shield. Something official, something unquestionable, something that did not need to be explained, but Angela did not react to it. She did not challenge it. She simply watched him with the same steady focus, as if she were measuring not his words but the space between them, and that made it harder to stand behind them, harder to believe they were enough. The second officer shifted again, his gaze flicking toward the body cam, then back to Hayes, a silent reminder that everything was being recorded, everything would be seen again later without the urgency of the moment to shape it. And that awareness seemed to settle over the scene like a thin layer of pressure, invisible but present. Hayes straightened his shoulders, committing now, because hesitation was worse than being wrong. Hesitation invited doubt, and doubt was something he could not afford in front of an audience. "Hand me the folder," he said again, this time not as a request, but as a directive, his hand extending once more, closer now, leaving less space between them. And for a moment it seemed like Angela might comply, her grip loosening slightly, her posture shifting just enough to suggest movement. But instead of handing it over, she turned it just a few degrees, the edge catching the flashing light again. And this time the reflection lingered longer, long enough for the outline inside to become clearer. The unmistakable shape of a badge clipped neatly against the inner lining, polished metal catching the red and blue glow in a way that did not belong to anything ordinary. And Hayes saw it. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. Enough for his expression to falter for the briefest moment. Enough for the certainty in his stance to lose its sharpness. And the second officer saw it too, his brow tightening slightly as his attention sharpened, the casual distance in his posture replaced by something more alert, more aware. "What is that?" he asked quietly, not accusing, not confrontational, just curious. And Angela did not answer immediately. She let the question sit, let it echo softly in the space between them, as if giving it weight, as if allowing it to become part of the record before responding. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, carrying just enough to reach both officers without raising. "Something you should have asked about first," she said. And the words did not land as criticism. They landed as fact, simple and unembellished. And Hayes felt the shift deepen, the ground beneath his confidence tilting just enough to force him to adjust, his eyes returning to the folder, to the glimpse he had caught, to the detail that refused to be dismissed now. And for the first time the possibility formed clearly in his mind, not as a conclusion but as a question, one that he did not want to ask out loud, because asking it would mean acknowledging that he might already be on the wrong side of this moment. And around them the quiet street held its breath, the faint glow of phone screens steady, the distant sounds fading into the background, as if the entire scene had narrowed down to this single exchange, this single realization unfolding in real time. And the certainty Hayes had walked in with no longer felt like an anchor. It felt like something slipping through his fingers, one quiet second at a time. The question hung in the air like something fragile, something that could not be taken back once answered. And for a brief second no one moved. Not Hayes, not the second officer, not even the quiet line of onlookers who had grown still without realizing it. Their phones held steady, as if instinct told them this moment mattered more than the ones before it. And Hayes felt the weight of it pressing in, not from the crowd, not from his partner, but from the realization forming piece by piece in his mind, a realization he had not planned for, one that did not fit into the sequence he had already committed to, and that made it dangerous, because it meant he could not control how it would unfold, his eyes fixed on the edge of the folder, on the faint glint of metal that had caught the light, and now that he had seen it, even partially, it was impossible to ignore, impossible to reduce to something ordinary. And yet his instincts resisted it, pushed against it, searching for a simpler explanation, something that would allow him to maintain the version of reality he had already chosen. "It does not change anything," he said, the words coming out more quickly than intended, as if speed alone could close the gap that had opened. But the second officer did not respond immediately, his attention still locked on the folder, his posture subtly shifting from passive observation to quiet concern, because he had seen enough to know this was no longer routine. And that knowledge settled between them like a silent warning. "Maybe it does," the second officer said finally, his voice low, careful, not confrontational, but firm enough to carry weight. And that was when the balance began to tilt, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, undeniable increments, like something heavy being placed on one side of a scale. Hayes exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest tightening as he forced himself to stay anchored, because stepping back now, questioning now, would mean acknowledging that he had moved too quickly, that he had built the situation on assumptions instead of facts, and that was not something he was prepared to accept in front of an audience, not with cameras recording, not with another officer watching. So he doubled down, the familiar instinct taking over. "Ma'am, I am giving you one more chance," he said, his tone controlled but edged with finality. "Hand me the folder so we can clear this up." And the words were meant to close the situation, to simplify it, to bring it back into a structure he understood. But Angela did not rush to respond. She did not react to the ultimatum. She simply looked at him, her expression unchanged, her presence steady in a way that made the urgency in his voice feel out of place, almost unnecessary. And then, without raising her voice, without shifting her stance, she spoke. "You are not trying to clear anything up," she said. "You are trying to confirm what you already decided." And the accuracy of it landed harder than any challenge could have, because it stripped away the language he was using to justify his actions, leaving only the truth underneath. And Hayes felt it, the exposure of it, the way the moment had shifted from something he controlled to something he was now part of, something that was being observed, recorded, and slowly understood by everyone present. And that realization tightened around him like a quiet pressure, invisible but impossible to ignore, his eyes flicking once more to the body cam, the small blinking light that had once reassured him now feeling like a witness he could not influence, a record that would not bend to his interpretation. And for the first time since the encounter began, doubt settled in fully, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, persistent, and growing. And Angela finally moved, not stepping back, not stepping away, but opening the folder just enough for the contents inside to become visible, the badge now unmistakable in the reflected light, its shape, its placement, its meaning no longer something that could be dismissed or overlooked. And the silence that followed was different from before, deeper, heavier, no longer just tension but realization, the kind that changes the direction of everything that comes next. And Hayes felt it as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud. The moment where control slips, where certainty fractures, where the truth begins to take its place whether he was ready for it or not. The badge did not need to be fully revealed for its meaning to settle into the space like something final, something irreversible. And the moment it caught the light clearly, even for a second, everything changed in a way that could not be undone, not by words, not by tone, not by authority. And Officer Hayes felt it in the way his shoulders no longer held the same certainty, in the way his stance shifted almost imperceptibly, as if his body understood before his mind was ready to accept it. The second officer took a small step back, not out of fear but out of awareness, creating just enough distance to separate himself from what was unfolding, his eyes moving between Hayes and Angela with a new level of attention, the kind that comes when a situation crosses an invisible line and becomes something else entirely, something official, something that carries consequences, and the quiet street seemed to recognize it too. The low murmur fading, the phone steady, the air holding still. As if even the night itself was waiting for the next move, and Angela closed the folder gently, not in a rush, not with emphasis, just a simple motion that carried its own weight, the soft sound of its sealing echoing louder than it should have in the silence. And when she looked back at Hayes, her expression had not changed, not in anger, not in satisfaction, just in clarity, as if the moment had finally aligned with what she already knew. "You should take a breath," she said quietly, her voice even, controlled, not commanding but grounded in something deeper than authority. And the suggestion was so unexpected, so out of rhythm with everything that had happened, that it landed differently than any order could have. Hayes blinked once, the tension in his jaw tightening before loosening slightly, the instinct to respond immediately replaced by a pause he could not quite avoid. And in that pause he became aware of everything at once: the blinking light of the camera, the presence of his partner, the watching eyes of the neighborhood, and most of all the realization that this moment was no longer moving forward under his direction. It was unfolding on its own, guided by something he had not accounted for, something he had overlooked from the very beginning. And that realization did not come as a sudden shock. It came as a slow, steady understanding, like a tide rising inch by inch until it could no longer be ignored. "If there has been a misunderstanding," he began, his voice measured now, more careful, the sharp edge from before replaced with something restrained, something cautious. But Angela did not interrupt him. She let him finish. She let him choose his words, because the words mattered now, every one of them. And he knew it. He could feel it in the way he spoke, in the way he weighed each sentence before letting it out. "We can resolve it properly," he added, and the phrasing was different this time. Not an assertion of control, but an attempt to regain balance, to step back into something structured, something procedural. And Angela nodded slightly, acknowledging the shift without pointing it out, without emphasizing it, because it did not need to be emphasized. It was already clear, already present in the tone, in the posture, in the space between them. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence returning, but no longer tense in the same way, no longer filled with conflict, but with transition, the kind that marks the exact point where something changes direction, where a narrative turns. And the second officer exhaled quietly, the sound almost lost in the stillness, as if he too had been holding his breath without realizing it. And somewhere in the distance a car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping across the scene before disappearing down the block, the world continuing on as if nothing had happened, even as everything in this moment had already shifted. And Hayes finally lowered his hand, the one that had been extended for the folder, letting it fall to his side in a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for what it represented. The release of control, the acceptance, however partial, that this situation was no longer his to define. And Angela watched him with the same steady presence, not pressing, not escalating, simply allowing the moment to settle into what it had become, a quiet turning point recorded in full view, carried not by force but by the weight of truth itself. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt decisive, like a line had been drawn without anyone needing to say it out loud. And Officer Hayes stood there with the weight of that realization settling fully into place, no longer something he could push aside or reinterpret, but something clear, undeniable, and permanent. His eyes drifting once more to the closed folder in Angela's hand, then back to her face. And for the first time he was not looking at her as a subject of suspicion, but as someone he needed to understand, someone he had misjudged in a way that could not be undone by simple correction. The second officer shifted again, but this time it was not uncertainty, it was recognition, his posture straightening slightly as the pieces aligned in his own mind, his voice quieter now, almost respectful without fully stating why. "Ma'am," he said, the word chosen carefully, deliberately, as if acknowledging something that had not been formally introduced yet, but was already understood. And Angela acknowledged it with a slight nod, not as acceptance of respect, but as confirmation of awareness. And then, without raising her voice, without stepping forward or asserting presence in any overt way, she spoke with a clarity that carried through the entire scene. My name is Angela Brooks, she said, each word measured, steady, leaving no room for interpretation, and I report to this district starting tonight. And the words landed not with force, but with certainty, the kind that does not need emphasis to be understood, and Hayes felt it fully then. The final shift, the complete reversal of everything he had assumed, everything he had acted on, everything he had believed was under his control just minutes before, and it was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was quiet, precise, and absolute. The kind of realization that settles deep and does not leave, his breath catching slightly as he processed it, the timeline rearranging itself in his mind, the sequence of actions now seen from a completely different angle, each decision carrying a weight he had not recognized at the time, and around them the stillness deepened, the watching crowd no longer just observing an incident, but witnessing a moment of consequence, something that would not simply fade when the lights were turned off. The second officer stepped back another half step, instinctively creating space, his gaze lowering briefly before returning to Angela with a different kind of attention, one that carried understanding. And Hayes finally spoke, his voice quieter now, stripped of the edge it once carried. "Captain," he said, the word unfamiliar on his tongue in this context, but necessary, undeniable, and once spoken it changed everything, not just in title but in tone, in posture, in the entire shape of the moment. And Angela did not react to the title with satisfaction or acknowledgement. She simply held his gaze, steady, composed, allowing the weight of it to exist on its own, and the blinking red light of the body cam continued its silent recording, capturing not just the words but the shift, the transformation of authority, the exact point where assumption gave way to truth, and Hayes felt the full gravity of it settle over him, not as punishment, not as humiliation, but as clarity, the kind that reveals more than it accuses, the kind that forces reflection whether it is welcomed or not. And for a moment no one spoke, the quiet stretching just long enough for the reality of it to fully take hold, before the night resumed its soft, distant sounds, unchanged yet somehow different, as if something important had just been set into place. The word lingered longer than anything else that had been said that night. Captain, not because it was loud or forceful, but because of what it carried with it, the shift in position, in responsibility, in truth, and Officer Hayes felt it settle into his chest with a weight that was impossible to ignore, his posture adjusting almost instinctively, not out of fear, but out of recognition, the kind that comes when something undeniable is finally seen clearly. And for a moment, he searched for the right words, something that could bridge the gap between what had just happened and what needed to come next. But the silence stretched before he could find them, the blinking red light on his body camera continuing its steady rhythm, indifferent to hesitation, indifferent to discomfort, capturing everything exactly as it was. And Angela Brooks stood in front of him with the same calm presence she had held from the beginning, unchanged by the reveal, unchanged by the shift, as if this outcome had never been in question for her, as if she had simply allowed it to unfold at its own pace. And when she spoke again, her voice was neither cold nor warm, just precise, grounded in something that did not need to prove itself. "What matters now is what happens next," she said, her eyes steady on his, not accusatory, not dismissive, just direct, and that clarity made it harder to look away, harder to retreat into defensiveness or explanation, because there was no hostility to push against, no anger to respond to, only the expectation of accountability. And Hayes nodded once, slowly, the motion small but deliberate, his voice quieter when it came, stripped of everything unnecessary. "Understood, Captain," he said, and this time the word did not feel unfamiliar, it felt required. And the second officer straightened fully now, his stance aligning with the shift that had taken place, his gaze moving briefly toward Hayes before returning to Angela, waiting, attentive, as if recalibrating in real time. And the onlookers at the edges of the street remained still, their phones still raised, but something about the atmosphere had changed. The tension replaced by a quiet understanding that this moment had already reached its turning point, that what remained was not conflict but consequence. And Angela glanced briefly at the body camera, the small device that had recorded every second, every assumption, every word, and then back to Hayes. "You made decisions based on what you thought you saw," she said, her tone even, her words measured. Not on what was actually there. And there was no accusation in it, only a statement, a simple truth laid out without emphasis. And Hayes felt it more deeply than any reprimand could have landed, because it was accurate, because it left no room for justification, and he exhaled slowly, the breath carrying with it the last remnants of resistance. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, the formality natural now, unforced, and Angela nodded once, not as approval, not as dismissal, but as acknowledgement that the moment had been understood, and then she shifted slightly, her attention expanding beyond just him, taking in the second officer, the scene, the quiet witnesses, before returning to Hayes. "We will address this properly at the station," she said, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a continuation, a next step that carried structure, process, and fairness, and Hayes accepted it with another nod, the path forward now clear in a way it had not been before. And as the flashing lights continued to pulse softly against the houses, against the pavement, against the stillness of the night, the scene began to settle, not ending, but transitioning, moving from confrontation into something quieter, something more reflective, where the real impact of what had happened would begin to take shape. The flashing lights no longer felt urgent as they softened against the quiet houses, their reflections stretching across the pavement in slow, rhythmic pulses that seemed to echo the shift that had already taken place, and Captain Angela Brooks stood for a moment longer without speaking, allowing the scene to settle into its new shape, not forcing it forward, not rushing the resolution, just letting the silence do what it needed to do. And Officer Hayes remained still, his gaze lowered briefly, before lifting again, not to challenge, not to defend, but to acknowledge the tension that had once driven every word now replaced by something quieter, something heavier, a recognition that could not be undone or explained away. And in that quiet space the weight of the body camera became unmistakable, no longer just a device clipped to his uniform, but a record of every assumption, every decision, every moment where certainty had replaced observation. And he could feel it now, not as pressure from the outside, but as something internal, something that would follow him long after the lights were gone, long after the street returned to normal. The second officer stepped back toward the cruiser, his movements measured, respectful of the shift that had occurred, the unspoken understanding that this moment belonged to something larger than routine. And Angela finally turned slightly, her attention moving toward the street, toward the quiet line of neighbors who had watched everything unfold without interruption, their phones still raised, their presence a silent reminder that this was not just an isolated exchange. It was something witnessed, something shared, something that carried beyond this single block. And without raising her voice she spoke, not to the crowd, not directly, but in a way that reached them anyway. "You can put those away," she said calmly, her tone neither commanding nor dismissive, just steady. And one by one the phones began to lower, not out of obligation, but out of a quiet respect for the way the moment had resolved, the way it had shifted without escalation, without force. And as the last screen dimmed, the street seemed to exhale, returning to itself, the distant sounds of the night slowly filling the space again, a car passing, a door closing somewhere down the block, life continuing as it always did. And Angela stepped forward then, not toward Hayes, not toward the officers, but past them, her movement smooth, unhurried, as if the path ahead had already been decided. And Hayes turned slightly to watch her go, his posture straight but no longer rigid, the weight of the moment settling into something quieter, something that would remain long after the scene had ended. And as she reached the edge of the light, the glow catching briefly on the badge inside her folder, she paused for just a second, not looking back, not needing to, and then continued forward, the sound of her footsteps soft against the pavement, steady, certain, and behind her the red and blue lights continued their slow pulse, no longer defining the moment, only marking where it had happened, where something had shifted in a way that did not need to be spoken aloud, because it had already been understood. And in that quiet understanding the night closed gently around the scene, leaving behind nothing but the memory of a moment where truth had been seen clearly, and where silence had said everything that needed to be said.